Welcome to the Negev Podcast, where Christians come together to come out of the wilderness. Here we explore topics inside and outside of the Bible under the light and revelation of Jesus Christ through the Word of God. Where did we leave off yesterday? So we can just pick that up. I think we
started
wanted
going on your first thought from the top, and then I had stopped you to ask if it was possible to track the lives of the apostles if they did not benefit at all from if they were to have changed or added anything. And you had made a good point where nobody's going to die on a lie.
Yeah, a lie that they know is a lie.
Right.
So if I'm a Muslim and I die for Islam, and if Islam is not true, which I believe it's not true, then I might die for it, but that doesn't mean I know that it's not true. But you're not going to die for something you know is false.
If I could also add something interesting to that was presented to me, some of the first witnesses that they talk about in the Gospels to Jesus's resurrection are women. And at that time, that would have not been seen as a fully credible source. And for those men to use them, it's seen as profound because they're like, no, this happened with them, this happened over here, and like it would have not looked good to their reputation to have presented it that way, but that's like they were presenting what they believed to be the truth in that regard.
And so I think that ties into, or at least that becomes a good transition for some of the things I'd wanted to talk about yesterday. The interesting thing about the history in terms of the first century when all of this is going on, plus what we have recorded in the Gospels or in the testimonies of people, is it's not just what they wrote down, but it's also, like Teeples was bringing up with the female witnesses, which was not normal at that time, to have females witness about a major event just because of how they didn't see that as a credible source in the ancient world, or at least in that part of the ancient world. There's other aspects that get brought in that are very odd. So like, I remember yesterday, one of the things that you kept asking was, how do we know that the apostles, even if they told what they believed was the truth, how do we know essentially that they told the whole truth, right? That they didn't modify this part or that part. Like, I think your concern or your statements were around, like, for example, how do we know that they didn't inject something concerning hell? Like, in order to get people to be more afraid of what's coming and essentially coerce them into believing this. Would that be fair? A fair summary?
It would be, or in my mind was to, add in hell because, otherwise why would people be afraid of the second death? There wasn't such a severe punishment.
Right.
Or an eternal punishment.
And so I think, as I heard you and Teeples going back and forth, for me, it was trying to figure out how would I respond to those questions and what you just had said, which is ultimately, I think that the apostles wrote down everything that they experienced. And I think that they were very careful to describe what they had seen because of the importance of what they had seen, right? In the sense that, what is it that these people claim to have seen or have experienced? They claim that they experienced the risen Christ. They claim that they interacted with God himself because they believe Jesus to be God, and that they believe that Jesus was the Messiah prophesied from the Old Testament, coming to fulfill all these different prophecies about the redemption of mankind and also the restoration of the nation of Israel, right? So there's all these pre-expectations that they had coming into this situation. And then Jesus is the one who fulfills him. So one of the things that fulfills these expectations, one of the things that I think I would look at would be the importance of the, almost like this pre-story or prologue. In like Lord of the Rings, you know how you have that opening sequence where they describe the War of the Ring and everything that happened with Sauron? For me, it's kind of similar with the Old Testament. The Old Testament is establishing all of this expectation and all of this backdrop and context. And then Jesus gets dropped right in the middle of that. Okay. And he has to fulfill specific things in order to be even seen as a valid candidate for the Messiah who these Jewish people have been waiting for. And so that's why I think they would have been very careful in how they would have presented it, in trying not to distort the record. I say this because right now on my screen, there's, for example, Luke. Luke opens up his gospel with, and I'll just read it from the NLT. I have it on the ESV as well, so I'm using both those translations. But Luke chapter 1 opens up, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us as from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. I think this is very, very important because Luke essentially establishes in the very beginning of what he's writing, like, look, all these people have been saying all this stuff about what just happened in Israel or in Jerusalem right after the before the crucifixion and after it. Luke's role or job in writing the gospel is to go in and investigate all of these accounts by interviewing all these people. Like when we had talked about Band of Brothers, how you could watch an episode, the episode plays out, and then at the end they had all these interviews with the people who were actually there, right? Trying to understand, okay, what actually happened from your perspective. That's what this is an account of. It's a writing of that. And so the Band of Brothers is an interesting analogy because even though we can say right now, oh, hey, but I wasn't there, I'm not able to validate those people's experiences, what they said and what was written down doesn't become false all because time, 2000 years pass, right? It's like, take the Band of Brothers TV show that was shot, I think, early 2000s, right? If we take the TV show and it's a snapshot in history, it's almost like a document of what Steven Spielberg and his crew put together and what happened in World War II. If we fast forward 1,000 years from now, that doesn't change the truthfulness of what those men attest to or testify to, or what was documented in the series. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
And so I think you're dealing with a similar situation with these accounts based on the writings of what you see with Luke. And then same thing with Peter. If you're looking at 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, for we are not making up clever stories when we told you about the powerful coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We saw his majestic splendor with our own eyes. When he received honor and glory from God the Father, the voice from the majestic glory of God said to him, this is my dearly loved son who brings me great joy. We ourselves heard that voice from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. This account that Peter is telling us in 2 Peter. This is a reference to the transfiguration in the Gospels when Jesus is on the mountain and Peter and John are there witnessing firsthand that he's being essentially transformed into his actual appearance, and then God speaks from the clouds. Peter testifies like, no, we didn't make this up. This is what we saw. You see what I mean? Like, this is what we experienced, and we're just conveying this to you. Same thing with Luke. As I said earlier, I believe that the writers were doing everything they could to preserve the events and the recollections of what happened. As a Christian, I also believe they had help from the Holy Spirit in drawing these things to remembrance. But as these things are being captured, the question often comes up by many skeptics is, how do I know that these stories can be trusted? Or how do I know aspects of the story have been modified? And I think those are valid questions to ask. I think the response to that question then becomes, if the story has been modified in some way, the question would be, or the responsibility would have to fall on the person asking the question in terms of where has it been modified and how? Like if we ask the question of a topic like hell, because people will ask this on all kinds of things, but if you're looking at something like hell, could the concept of hell have been brought into the Gospels or into the scriptures? Yes, they could have, but the question is, did they? And if a person is believing that hell was brought in, it would be a question of, how do we show that it's been brought in? Like usually it's kind of this idea that, I think the way you were expressing it was, how do I know the apostles didn't bring it in? And I wonder about that because the person who speaks the most of hell isn't actually the apostles, it's Jesus himself. So like when you're going through the gospels, the person who speaks the most about hell is Jesus. And so it's like, how do we settle that, or how do we reconcile that? And is the concept of Jesus, or not Jesus, the concept of hell really antithetical, or really that different or contradictory to the message as a whole being brought in? Does that make sense? I know I rambled on, but I just wanted to get all of that off the table.
Well, I know I'm listening to you. It's it's not necessarily that the apostles would have made it up. That's and all I was referring to, and you made a good point. You basically said that it is possible to track the lives of these men that didn't, if they didn't benefit, because I consider myself logical in many ways. So if they didn't benefit in any way from their stories, then it would stand to reason that, or it's logical that they didn't make any of it up.
Hmm. Man, I wish I would have just rested on that instead of everything. I just, I think one of the points also that I had in my notes while you and Teeples were talking, which is the ultimate struggle, I think, for a person who's coming to read the Bible, anyone, is whether or not they trust what's there. It's a question of trust. And that's not something that ultimately I think can be, no matter the amount of arguments someone like Teeples or myself is able to provide, and no matter how logical or consistent or the amount of evidence that they bring to the table, I don't think those things are enough to bring a person to trust in God. Does that make sense? I think
Okay.
what happens is those things only become, what they do is they help remove hurdles or barriers that an individual might have coming to the text, where it's like, these are the things that are preventing me from trusting God for these reasons. These are the things preventing me from trusting God. And ultimately, the person who is responsible for completely removing those doubts, or at least getting the individual to a position of trust and faith, or trust and faith, because I see the two as synonymous, is God himself. And that's what the scriptures teach us, right? I would have never been saved through the argumentations or the evidences that people were bringing to me. Like my salvation or testimony experience was a very personal one, right? I was having interactions with the Potter's mom. She was discipling me in a very similar manner, like we're discussing here, except I was a bit more hostile than you, James. Like I was pretty condescending in many areas and very argumentative. But she was walking me through a lot of the questions that I had and things that I was proposing in terms of like, well, why would God do this? Or why does the Bible say that? On and on and on. And then ultimately, what did it for me was an experience that I had with God. And I think that's what has to kind of move the person from unbelief to belief, is that experience. And I think that experience comes the more a person searches for God, and the more that a person is willing to listen to what God has. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, but I guess it doesn't. I would say no, it doesn't necessarily make sense. I get a lot of thoughts running around in my head. One of them was the free will conversation that we had, and then I have other thoughts on. I don't know if the right word is preordained or predestination or whatever.
Hmm.
Like, does everyone that's ever going to be born that has been born, when they were born, or did God already know that they would be in hell or not? I guess that's a whole other conversation possibly, because it's like in my mind, it's like, if why create us with free will, because it gives us the choice, like Teeples is saying that, with the example of my daughter, if you create them one way, then how do it's not real love, or it's not a real feeling if you didn't have free will. But then again, he created us knowing that this particular person is going to burn in hell for all of eternity. That God doesn't seem like a great person that I'd want to worship. It's somebody I might, if I believed, I would fear, and maybe want to turn away from my wicked ways just so I don't burn in hell. But I don't look in that aspect. I don't look at him as somebody that, wow, that's such a gracious God. Thank you for all the wonderness.
Hmm.
I grew up in Christian school, so like I've read the Bible front to back before. I've studied the Bible at times. And then what ended my belief was those thoughts that it just doesn't make sense. And, I haven't had any of those spiritual awakenings or those crazy moments with God.
Two
Go ahead.
things. One, when you're saying kind of the experiences, I think the experiences can be dramatic, like in my case, but I also think they can be very subtle, like in my wife's case. If you they don't have to be super dramatic in order to bring a person to faith. Like my wife experienced, if you ever ask her about her coming to Christ, it was very, very, it's so subtle. I had missed it when she first described it to me. And I tend to think of it more like I can read about my wife. I trust my wife. I trust my wife where if I am traveling to New York or to Maryland to visit family, she's not out with another guy doing whatever. You see what I mean?
Mhm.
Now, I can read about my wife and get a sense of her character, but the reading isn't what convinced me about that alone. It was the experience I had with her. That's kind of what I mean is that there's an experiential component that I think happens in a person coming to faith, to trust, that's required, not just in a relationship with God, but in any human relationship. It's not enough to be told that someone is trustworthy. You have to know it. You have to know it through experience. And so that's why I can understand you're wrestling with a lot of these concepts because, it's a question of, how or when or if you've had that experience with God, or maybe you've had it in the past and you need more. I don't know because, I honestly, these are the kinds of questions that I think only God can answer. Does that make sense?
It does. Can you share your experience?
I can share it, but again, mine's a bit more, I don't want to say dramatic. I like, especially in this situation, I would ask, I'll share it, but then I would ask at some point if you could ask my wife about hers, because hers
Sure.
is a lot more subtle.
Yeah.
Hers is a lot less. I guess I don't want to say dramatic, but it's yeah, more subtle. To keep it brief, basically what happened for me was just like I said, I was being discipled by the Potter's mom. I was going over to their home every night, asking questions about the Bible, asking questions about God, all kinds of stuff. And what happened was, and this was over a period of, I think, 3 months. And so what happened was one night she gives me a DVD, a movie called The Gospel of John. And it's the movies, you know what a screenplay is?
Yes.
Okay, so screenplay, for anyone who doesn't know, is just it's basically the dialogue that the writers use, or the actors use to act from. And so the screenplay for the Gospel of John was based on the Gospel of John, but the Good News translation of the Gospel of John. And so the movie's about 3.5 hours long, I think. And so she hands me the movie. I go home that night and I'm like, okay, I can't believe I'm going to watch this because the first thing that you would have known about me back then is I hated what I called Jesus movies. Anything related to Jesus in a movie, I completely hated it because my mom used to watch them all the time when I was a kid. And I thought they were the most boring things ever. And I just hated them. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to put this into the DVD player, start watching for a few minutes and see what happens. I put it in and immediately I'm like, yeah, I don't get what's going on. I'm just kind of like, they're like saying all this stuff. And I'm like, okay. But I still keep watching and I keep watching. I keep watching. And, I'm going through and I'm like, okay, okay, okay. And it feels like I'm watching like a foreign film. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I understand what you're saying in English, but I don't understand it.
Okay.
And then it gets to the scene, it's the Last Supper. And Jesus is having supper with his disciples. And he begins describing basically the sacrifice that he's about to experience on the cross. And all of a sudden, it hits me. Like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like a ton of bricks. It's almost like if I had a weight that was that was coming down on me. And so I fall on the ground and I start weeping and crying uncontrollably. And the only thing I start doing is I start calling out to God and I start saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's because I had felt it's often described like the weight of your sin. That's what it literally felt like for me. And I felt like everything, It's almost like I could feel everything that I had ever done against God. Whenever I cursed God, whenever I blasphemed God, whenever I mocked him, I did this very openly as an atheist. Whenever I mocked Christians, right? It's like I felt all of that, including the way that I lived. And so I was just crying. I felt so sorry and so overwhelmed by that I was just asking God to forgive me. And I was just like, God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I said it literally like that. I was just like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I couldn't stop saying that. And I just kept crying and I kept crying. And then all of a sudden it was done. And I unpaused the movie and I continued watching it. And from that point, I watched that movie like 3 more times in a row, 3 days. And I just started reading the Bible and I couldn't stop reading. And I just kept reading and I just kept reading. And everything was drawing me in more and more. The more that I read, the more that I talked with God, the more I talked with Sherry, the more I talked, I just that was it for me. And so I didn't understand. I knew when I was reading, especially since I was reading the King James, because I had a really hard time with the King James. It's like I knew I didn't understand what was there, but I knew I had found something, and that's all I can say. It's like I didn't understand it. I was just like, I'm like, but I know this is it. And so I just kept going and it just kept going. And as I kept going, God would kept pulling me along, kept guiding me. So that was my experience. There's a whole lot more to it than that, both before and after. But that was the moment. That was the moment I believe I got saved.
Thank you. I actually think you might have told me that before. Now that I hear you say,
Yeah, I was pretty sure of that. But and I'm glad it's on the record. The person, like I said, whenever we maybe meet up for a potluck again, the person who you should ask now that you've heard or you're recalling the conversation we had around this is my wife, because when you speak with Nina, hers wasn't that at all. It was actually really, really subtle. It's just
well,
like
I will ask. I will ask. I'm interested. And it looks like that movie is on. I'm not going to say I'm going to have the same experience, but I'm interested in that movie now. It's on Amazon Prime, so I'll watch it.
yeah, and maybe it'll help, maybe it won't, but that's just what happened to me.
Okay.
I'm a huge person when it comes to having a dialogue with people, providing a defense for the faith, giving, as Peter says, a reason for the always be prepared for to give a reason for the hope that is in you. Right. As Christians, Teeples and myself are commanded by God through the scriptures to be able to provide strong arguments and reasons for why we believe. But I don't think those reasons are enough to bring a person over to the other side. There has to be an experiential component to it, because I believe that's at the center of human relationships. And the Gospels make it clear that the believer is in a relationship with God. There has to be something that causes you to believe in God. Again, our experiences, we're both married, and it's like we came to trust our wives at some point. How did that happen? You know,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it would have just happened by me reading a report or testimony of my wife. I mean, I would have found it interesting, and it would have been maybe a reason for me to reach out to her and talk to her more. But I needed to experience my wife at some level through a relationship. How you find that? Hmm?
I was going to share an experience, but if you want, go ahead and finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say how you find that. That's between ultimately you and God. I don't know how that comes about.
Gotcha. Well, to share an experience, I had similar questions to what I gave you and Teeples yesterday. They weren't as far as they are now, which I gave you. So before, my questions were, I had those questions leading up to a certain point, and then I was big into drugs and alcohol for a long time, and I went to a rehab center here in Casa Grande, up in Casa Grande. And in my experience through that, I was on let's call it a cloud nine, if you will. You're in touch spiritually. You're trying to get right, get your family back in you, all these things. And I came out very open, very clear minded. It'd been 30 days, since I had any substance in my body whatsoever. And I can't remember which day. It was either a Friday or a Saturday that I graduated the rehab center. And so that following Sunday, I went to church at Faith in Christ, which was Pastor Mike Parada's church.
Hmm.
We were going with that at the time. And in that service, I felt like I had a spiritual experience. I even told this to Pastor Mike. So, like, while he was preaching during the worship, I felt like Mike specifically was looking directly at me
Hmm.
almost the whole time.
Interesting.
In my
Hmm.
remembrance,
Hmm.
he was singing directly at me, making eye contact,
Like while he was
preaching
preaching?
while he's preaching and during the worship service.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And everything was fitting. Oh, and I don't believe this at all, but almost like my wife said, "Hey, he's coming home. Prepare a service specifically for him." I know he didn't do that, but
Hmm.
it was that crazy of what was going on, and I had an overwhelming sense of, okay, now is the time to be saved, get saved.
Hmm.
However, I also knew from my Baptist background growing up what to say, what I
Hmm.
should be feeling, all of those things. So, I mean, I was in tears through the whole service, and I remember going up right before the service ended, basically talking to some of the elders. Chad Kent was one of them, Tim McClary, Mike Parada, and maybe one other guy, and they all stood around me, and I confessed my sins. I asked Jesus in the heart to save me, the whole nine, and that was the day I got saved. I got baptized that day with my wife, actually, because I think she never got baptized or something like that.
Hmm.
And I talked to Mike. I said, I think I said something like, "Why were you talking directly to me?" And he didn't know what I was talking about. So I don't know if something spiritual was going on there or not. So anyway, that being said, I was super on fire, just kind of like you
Hmm.
said, just constantly reading. I asked, what to read. Mike said, read the book of Daniel. So that's where I started reading. I was going to Bible studies. I was engaging. I almost don't want to say this part because I'm sure this had part of it, but I was completely sober up until a certain point, and then I drank again. And from that point on is what started all my questions again, right?
See.
And then I started going backward as into starting to rethink all of my questions, and then things start making sense. And then all of those things just I couldn't wrap my brain around it, and I just completely turned my back on it again.
Got it.
So I have continued to go to church. I counseled with Pastor Will, with you, on multiple occasions because I'm in constant search of that. But that was my only possible spiritual experience, if you will. So
Hmm.
yeah, there you go. That's what happened there.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I don't think you've ever told me that. I appreciate it because it gives me more insight, at least into your life and your experiences. Just like what obviously I shared mine with you. One of the things that strikes me is what I've told you before, James, which is you don't come off to me as someone who has completely turned from God. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
Because I know what it looks like from personal experience in terms of my own life. And like we didn't record it, but I think the last time we were on a Zoom call, I told you about members of my family who have turned from God and what that looked like. And
Yeah.
so I don't see you in that boat. And when I think about that, I wonder if the experience that you told me about has anything to do with that, in the sense that one thing I don't want to give this depiction of in the life of a believer or someone who's seeking God is that journey is always perfect. Like you said a moment ago, being on fire for God, as if the life of the person is always on fire. I've gone through maybe I've mentioned this to you before. I know Teeples knows this. One of my big struggles, yours is substance abuse through alcohol. Mine is lust and pornography. That's been my struggle throughout my Christian walk almost my whole life. And I remember there was one time that I stumbled and I walked in. This was before church. It was a Saturday evening. Did something I shouldn't have done. And I woke up the next morning. And I've told Teeples this before, so this will probably be. And remember, or I should say, I had been a believer at that point, probably for about 5 years, maybe 6 years. And what happened was, I go into the shower and I start crying. because I'm just like in my mind, I'm like, there's no way I'm a believer. There is no way I'm following Christ after what I just did in the life that I'm living. Like, there's no way. And so I'm just crying because I'm like, I've lost it all. You know what I mean? Like, it's gone. And I'm thinking about giving up. And it was just like, because I was even considering not going to church that morning. And then it was like a bolt or like a flash in my mind where I had this moment of like, wait a second. I remember what it was like to not want God in my life at all. I remember clearly what that was like. And so I know I'm not there. I know I don't hate God. I know I haven't rejected God. I know that I'm not blaspheming God in terms of, stay away from me. I want nothing to do with you in that sense. I know these things because I know what it's like to do it. And so that kicked me out of that mindset and caused me to come back to him. It pulled me out of that. Why do I say that? Because again, if I believe that you truly rejected God and you're like, I want nothing to, I don't think we would be having these conversations like we've talked about before. I understand though you're wrestling with him and the questions that you are asking, like free will. Free will is a very hard question to answer. This concept that you brought up, or this question, like if God knew this was going to happen, why did he do that? Why would he allow this to be the case? And there's answers I want to give to that, which I will. I just don't want to jump into it just yet. I'm more or less acknowledging where you're at and wanting to encourage you to continue to search, because I don't think you'll find answers anywhere else in this world, to tell you the truth. At least everywhere that I've searched, from atheism to new age to the occult to conspiracy theories, I didn't find answers that were satisfying in any of those things, because every single one of those things always led me down a path of despair, and ultimately, like, it wasn't fulfilling, or I just wasn't satisfied. So even
Well,
though that's my personal opinion, I don't believe you're going to find answers anywhere else.
I agree in a couple ways. Like I said to Teeples yesterday, he made me think differently and more than I've ever thought before. But there was one pastor that I had asked these questions for, and this is years prior to rehabbing that experience I told you about.
Mm-hmm.
um, I was asking these questions to this pastor, and the only other person, well, the only person that gave me even a brief ounce of hope told me this, and I might be botching the words. I'm not as intelligent as some, but I think he used the word predestination or preordained, basically saying that when God created the world, because he is the beginning and the end, or because of the way he is, everything that will happen already did happen. So it's not like a failure, but when he created in that realm of time to where he created and it's already over, so nothing can be changed. Because I think my questions were along the lines of like, because I was dealing with my mom's death. My mom was a good woman, and she suffered with cancer. She suffered bad, right? And why would a good woman, a good Christian woman, be put through all that? So my questions were along those lines, like, you know, why would a baby be allowed to be raped, and all these things. So he was saying that, and I think that goes along with free will. He created life and the way things are from the beginning and end. So all of these things already happened. There is no, he can't necessarily intervene with his own creation. And that made me think, okay, I could at least possibly get on board with, but like you just said, that led me down another road of despair, in which
Mm.
case it brought up other questions. So saying all that to agree with what you just said.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because even as you're saying that, at least I can say one thing. I'm trying to find the verse. I'm looking it up on a separate screen, but while I do believe God sees the end from the beginning. He sees the whole picture. And I believe certain things are locked in place, that they're not going to be changed, like the crucifixion. I don't believe all things are locked in place. Does that make sense?
Well, as in, like, I guess what he was saying was is that the changes that he does make all happened in like real time. It all happened at that moment of creation, the beginning and the end.
All
Like,
happened
can
in
he
the
actively make a change? Like, I'm going to walk out that door and when we're finished here, could he physically change the fact that no, I'll go to the bathroom instead? He'll make me have to pee. You know what I
So
mean? Well, I'll go pee first.
can
Got
I
it.
ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
Because when you're talking about predestined, and I want to kind of go back to the free will thing that we were talking about a little bit, and glance kind of on God's foreknowledge, which is where you're talking about how he knows what's going to happen. Do you think that when he made, we're going to use a Joe as an example, just a hypothetical person, when he made Joe, he knew Joe was going to sin and he made him in that fashion? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you believe that that's how he made Joe?
He made Joe knowing that he was going to sin. If yeah, I think he made us all knowing what was going to happen.
So I guess the difference between that would be, I'm going to use terms, so maybe Ron has an idea of where I'm going with this, but in predestined, there's another term that gets thrown around called predetermined, where it's like
Okay.
God determined this thing to take place. So his determination was Joe would go to hell. Predestined is a little bit different to my understanding of the way that it works. And that's why I'm trying to understand a distinction between how you're understanding it. Does that
Well,
make
I can't.
sense?
Yeah, it does, and that's I can't remember exactly the words he used. It was pre-de something, and from my understanding of what I can remember was that God is the beginning and the end. So everything that happened already happened the moment that He created it, as well as ended the moment He created it.
Right. So this concept and the word predestined, I do believe is in the Bible. It is in the Bible. And what you're describing sounds accurate from just what you're referencing. Some people take it a little bit too far and it goes into the determinism angle of determinism basically can be taken all the way to the point of God has basically established that a certain group of people are going to go to hell because he knows that they're going to be sinners from the beginning. And he has said, I know you're going to be a sinner, so I'm making you a sinner. And this is where you're going to go. Does that make sense? And that's what I'm trying to, was that the impression you got from what this pastor had said?
Yes, exactly.
That
Yes.
was okay. So David Pawson has an example when he talks about predestination. And I just want to express this to you as what I believe is the more accurate form of predestination. He talks about how when he was growing up, his dad was a farmer and he wanted to be a farmer. And everything was basically being established so that when David Pawson grew up, he could become a farmer. Like his dad had set up all of that for him. It was in his path, it was established. As we know, though, David Pawson became a pastor, and there were multiple things along the way in his life that brought him into that position in his life. And he had the opportunity to do both. He easily could have become a farmer just as much as he could have become a pastor. Neither of those are out of the realm of possibility, I guess you could say. But God's plan, God's predestination for him was to become a pastor and to preach to people. Even with everything that was established by his worldly father, he took a different path. Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is that God has a plan for us, but we could take a different path.
Yes. He
My question
establishes
would be,
things.
God knows we're going to take that different path.
He would know that, yes. But that's where we don't exactly understand how God's foreknowledge works with our free will. We know he knows it's going to happen, but we know that within that, he gave us the opportunity to freely choose.
Seems a little unfair. Kind of, I mean, fair in a way, but like kind of a bummer.
In what sense? Could you elaborate more?
It's like it's all up to me whether I screw myself out of heaven or not.
That's an interesting way to put it.
But I don't think
Hmm.
it's up to you.
Whether he screws himself out of heaven or not?
So you're making it out like you're deciding whether that happens or not. But when we look at what
Well,
is it?
wait. deciding, could you clarify what you mean, Teeples? Like whether you're deciding what? I'm kind of trying to follow along.
So I was about to get to the verse. It's faith comes by hearing and believing in the words of God. So when you're hearing it and you're believing these things, there's actions that we're called to because of that, but it's that belief at its foundational level that is the determining factor, not our works. Does that make sense?
Right, but if you don't believe, you would be excluding yourself from heaven, like he's pointing out. Would that be fair
Yes,
in
but
my understanding?
Because
what
with
it's
free will, it's my choice, right? I have the free will to turn it or say screw it, basically.
but what I'm hearing when you say that is not that you don't believe those aren't options. It sounds like you're already accepting the premise that those are the options, and you just feel like it's unfair that you have to now pick one of those two.
I do feel it's unfair based on, he made me this way, and I either choose this direction or I go to hell. That's the
When you
unfair part.
when you say he made you that way, what way are you referring to?
He made us knowing what we're going to choose already. He made Adam and Eve knowing that they were going to sin, so that way everybody else past that was born into sin. He made the heavens and the earth. He made the angels or Lucifer knowing that Lucifer was going to do what he's going to do.
Your contention is that because he made you knowing that you are a sinner or that you would sin, right? The choice to choose him or reject him despite that seems unfair. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, and maybe to look at it a different way, let's bring the free will back in.
Mm-hmm.
He created us with all the possibilities of sin, but why did sin have to be a part of our creation? We could still choose to love him or not, but we don't necessarily have to sin. So is choosing not to love Christ a sin? Or what I mean is that the ability to murder, rape, lie, or the 12 or the 10 commandments, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
those weren't a possibility of ours, but we still had the free will to choose to believe in him or love him, but there was no consequence to if we didn't. So 100% free will. Like, it doesn't sound like there's 100% free will, because we have the right to choose whatever we want, but if we don't, then this is the consequence.
I would like to clarify and backtrack just a little bit. You brought up all these different things that are sins, but the original choice that was given was eating of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil or not. Aside from the contemplation of what that actually meant, God really gave them access to everything but one thing. And they had free will to choose all of those things and that one thing. And they chose to do the one thing.
But
Does that
why
make
make
sense?
that one possible? Like, why even have any stipulation whatsoever and just continue on the way he made them initially? That is almost like a mistake there, if you will, if you want to put it.
Hmm. I believe God made Adam and Eve with free will built in already from the beginning. I think
Right.
what him bringing to their attention the aspect of this is the tree with the fruit of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil. You can either take from it or not take from it. You can either obey God or disobey God. I think what he does in bringing to their attention is allowing them to become aware that they can either choose to obey God or disobey God in that situation. So essentially,
Well,
they've always had free will. It's just now because God is saying, well, now you have the ability, because free will in and of itself has built in the freedom to choose God or reject him. Does that make sense? It has to. Or how would it be? How would it, if it does not have the ability to choose or reject God, how then would it be free will? I guess is what I would ask.
okay. I'm gonna get a little argumentative here, maybe possibly condescending for the point of this conversation. So
Sure.
I'm gonna say, well, why create obey and disobey? I mean,
Hmm.
if you take God created all the things that we know, and now we put English words to it. Back in the day, who knows what their original language was, whatever. But I don't have and this is going to sound really stupid, but I'm just doing it for the sake of the argument.
Right.
I don't have the ability to commit Jigglypuff. You know, it doesn't exist. But I do have the ability to commit murder. So why do I have the ability to commit murder when there could have been a multitude of other things that he could have created our abilities to do that he didn't? So we are limited to what we know and what our bodies are capable of. But again, why create, obey, disobey?
I think I see what you're asking. And I would say free will is not the ability to choose anything. Does that make sense?
Expand.
So free will is the ability to choose between options. So, for example, if I say to my kid, all right, we're going to have dinner tonight, you can either have steak, chicken, or fish, right? He's got three options to choose. And then he says, why don't I have the ability to fly to New York? That's not an option that's available for him and the choices that he can make. That then doesn't eliminate free will.
Can I
Yeah.
bounce off of what you just said, Ron?
Mm-hmm.
If he's only giving him steak, chicken, or fish, I
Mm-hmm.
forget, was that the three options?
Yeah, those are the three options. I should have probably limited it to, but whatever.
It's fine. If you've got steak, chicken, and fish, Caleb doesn't know any other options that are available. Ron is still presenting him the entire paradigm. Ron is still in complete control in that decision, as opposed to Ron saying, hey, you have access to the fridge, just like God gave access to the whole earth to tend it, to take care of it, everything they wanted to do. He gave them access to every plant in the Garden of Eden, except for one thing. God gives Caleb access to the fridge, says, hey, you can eat whatever you want in there, but you have to have dinner before you have dessert. Caleb now knows there's dessert in the fridge. So there's a paradigm that's outside of Ron's control that Caleb is capable of picking, because he's letting Caleb go over and choose what he wants. It's a true sense of free will instead of a restricted sense of free will.
But what if Ron poisoned one of those three options? Would Ron want to give Caleb the choice?
We're
So
talking about the
one of
poison
those,
being sin.
chicken, fish, or steak. One of them has ricin all over it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that kills you. And would you give your son those three choices, knowing that he
Well,
could choose one that will kill him?
well, I think okay. So I don't think the food itself is what kills, or I guess in using your example, it wouldn't be the food that itself kills him. It would be more Caleb. You have the option. So, Caleb, let me you have the option to eat steak, chicken, or fish. And Caleb decides that I'm going to have neither. I'm going to have ice cream, right? And what he's doing in that and choosing ice cream rather than the options that I gave him is essentially he's not listening to what I'm saying. He's disobeying me. And so it's not that the food is poisoned. The ice cream isn't poisoned, and neither is the other three items. The issue comes because he's chosen to disobey what I'm saying. Does that make sense? Because
In that analogy, yes.
because in the account of the garden, for example, it's not necessarily the fruit that is the problem. It's the fact that back to this item of free will, God in presenting this dilemma to or this information to Adam and Eve, specifically Adam first, he is making them aware that they can choose to either obey him or disobey him, right? He says you can eat of any fruit in the garden except for this fruit, the fruit from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in doing so, they choose to disobey God and eat from that fruit, which then introduces death into the world because God separates himself from them. I mean, he steps away. So it's not that the fruit itself is poison. It's they chose their free will. Basically God's given them free will, and they decided to use that free will to disobey God rather than obeying him.
Can I also add, God created heaven and earth. God created everything that there is. As far as we know, we don't know anything that exists that is not from God or in God's realm of control. So when you think of sin and the consequence being separation from God, what is there for them other than to be within God's creation, God's environment? Does that make sense?
You know,
So you had keyed in on that it's not necessarily the sin that's the problem, it's the separation from God, the choosing to do something against God. And we
But it
know
is the
that,
sin that's a problem. That's the sin, is
it,
choosing to disobey God.
I
yes, when
get
I
like
say it's not the sin that's the problem, the action of the sinning is the problem. All the sin is equal in its problem, in that you're choosing to go against God.
Oh, okay, got it. Now I'm following you.
It doesn't matter what sin you've committed, they're all equal in that regard, that you're going against God.
Right.
did God tell them, Adam and Eve, what would happen if they eat of the tree?
He
Yes.
warned, yes.
And so you had mentioned, your relationship with Nina. You could trust her based on your relationship. How or why did God create the ability for man to be swayed? Because what was it, the serpent that said, "Oh, he just doesn't want you to be like him."
Yes.
They had such a close walk with the legitimate God,
Mm.
and yet they still turned away. That's where the break in the story gets me. I love that we're taking it all the way back to the beginning because all that other stuff. It's like God creates man and woman, walks with them like physically, I would assume, spiritually, physically, whatever, next to God, and yet still makes that choice. It's like, why give why have that opportunity? Why just take that away?
I'm just trying to make sure I understand. You're asking, why did God give the opportunity for them to essentially destroy paradise? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Or
to
am I
do
getting that
that,
wrong?
to eat of the fruit, why create the serpent who was going to tempt him that he knew was going to happen? I mean, all of the above. He
Mm,
created Adam and Eve a very specific way, and why couldn't it have that been preserved? That perfect way that he made them could have
mm.
been made perfect and stayed perfect if it wasn't for the stipulation of the tree and or the serpent that tempted them to eat of the tree.
I see. Okay. I have an answer, but Teeples, I'll defer to you before I say anything. You were going to say something.
So So what comes to my mind, and I kind of go back to some analogies that we had already had, and I do agree with you. It's a tragic situation, but I also, again, not having kids, I have a cat. It's almost like a beautiful situation to me though, when it's like for your daughter with, I'm gonna go with like a flat tire. If every time she had a flat tire in her car, like, is she of the age to drive yet? She's almost there,
Yes,
right?
she's driving. She's driving.
She is. Okay. She gets a flat tire. If you come and change her flat tire every single time, she doesn't ever learn to change her flat tire. That's like an aspect of growth that she doesn't ever get access to have. And it goes deeper than that when you're looking at, you raised her from an infant. There's tons of things that you had the opportunity to teach her, and she got to grow and learn and experience, that turned her into who she is now. And it's my understanding God did that because he wanted to share in that aspect of creation and experience the ability to create us in that way. And it has a tragedy to it, but it also has that glory in the end where it's like he knows he will still successfully have those who will be loving him and following him. And it's our opportunity and choice to be able to do so.
So I hear you real quick. My argument to that is, why create a tire that can go flat? Like, we're
I,
assuming. I don't like analogies that use real world applications because we take away from the fact that God created. So if you're gonna use that analogy with the fact that I created my daughter the way I wanted to, with my love for my daughter, I wouldn't create those possibilities. So I get your analogy of, if I change that tire for her every time, she's never going to learn. But what if their tires didn't go flat? There's no need for her to learn how to change a tire.
so what if he had already done that?
Already done what?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is speculation and contemplation, but you look at the fact that angels exist.
Mhm.
Angels exist in a spiritual realm that is beyond our comprehension. And in some senses, they live very directly with God in the spiritual world already. And they can do some pretty crazy things from just what we see in scripture. If God is creating things and making creation, who's to say he didn't already establish something that was created in that fashion? We are just another type of creation that he has made.
Say that again, but in a different way.
Yeah, I'm not following.
In Job, there were all of the things listed that God was asking Job if he understood how they functioned and how they worked. And Job didn't have the understanding of those functions. It's not that nobody has an understanding of those functions, but God created those functions, and somewhere along the lines, we've been able to learn about it. But what if he's created things and it seems since we don't have a fullness of understanding of everything going on in the universe, like we have just the understanding that we have, I pose the idea of what if he did create an environment where the tire doesn't go flat, but still manage to create a free will in that environment. And that's why I bring up the angels. Like Lucifer was with God, praising him, and still chose to usurp God or attempt to usurp God, to be more precise.
Well, I think that
So
environment where the tire can't go flat is the pre-fallen world. I'm not convinced that the tire can now go flat because we've taken something that was created good, as you read through Genesis when God creates everything, and we've destroyed it, right? By turning a God against God and then God separating himself, everything starts to basically decay. That's how death comes into the world, right? Everything is now in this spiral downwards into a state of decay. And so, in hearing your question, James, not Teeples, but James, sorry, before I even answer that, I guess I understand what you're trying to say, James, but the only part that concerns me is that it's speculation, like you had said. Like it's difficult to kind of I'm not sure how to grapple with that. If that makes
this is a
sense.
loop that I'm in. It's a loop
And
because I'll say one thing and then you say something and it's like I loop it back and I'm not doing it on purpose. It's just I
no,
keep
no.
looping it in my mind, you know?
Well, that's why I'm trying to introduce this piece right here, which is why would God allow for Adam and Eve to be able to choose to disobey him? Am I getting that
Right.
right?
Yes. Or even what the concept of obey disobey, why is that created?
I see. My response to that, based on what I understand from the scriptures, is that the reason God allows for man to have free will and use that free will to either obey him or disobey him is because God is wanting to have a group of free will beings who choose to be loyal to him. Does that make sense? They freely choose God. They freely choose to want to be with him. And the reason I'm saying that is because when I read John chapter number 1, right, I have it up on the screen, and it says very clearly, he came into the world, he came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn not of a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. At the heart of everything we've been discussing is what is it that God is seeking? Because you're right. Why would God create these beings that can choose to disobey him?
Is he selfish?
Selfish in what sense?
I mean, why does God, the all-powerful being, our creator, have any needs whatsoever? Why
He
does he
doesn't.
need us to have free will in order to freely choose him?
Well, I don't think that's a question of need. Because God has the ability to create and decides to create, that doesn't therefore mean that he needs to create. Does that make sense? That just
So
means
why
he
did
chooses to create.
he is his question?
Yes.
Can you repeat that? No, can you repeat what you just said? You and Ron were
The,
talking at the same time.
oh, sorry. My very last statement was, why did he create?
Yes, because if it's not a necessity for God to create, but then he creates, why did he choose to create?
Yeah.
I think he chose to create because he wanted to have a group of people he could call his own and that would choose to be loyal to him.
But that's a need.
That's a desire, that's not a need.
Okay. Yeah. You're okay. So
You know,
why does the all powerful being have desires? That
um
seems like a human trait.
seems like a human trait.
It's a human trait that he created in us. So
Mm-hmm.
if he has desires, it, I mean, does he have the ability to sin himself?
Well, does having a desire is having desires necessarily a bad thing or ungodly? For example, I desire to love my son or I desire to see him happy, right?
Right?
Is that does having a desire indicate some type of flaw? I guess is what I'm asking.
No, but to have a desire that in turn creates his desire to have the people that he created choose him freely
Hmm.
is results in half or a percentage of those people suffering eternal damnation.
Yes.
So that's a selfish in a way, maybe that's not the right word, but it's like inconsiderate. I don't know the right word. It just doesn't seem, that part doesn't seem right to me.
Is it selfish if the individuals who choose to reject God freely chose to reject God? So, like, let's take, we were talking about Satan, for example, earlier on, and the angels that rebelled against God. When they chose to rebel against God, did they do so out of ignorance?
I would say no, because they knew God. They see him. They know that he's the creator because they're in the spiritual realm, if you will. I
When
would
a
say they have the ultimate free will and we don't, because ours is based off faith.
But when Adam and Eve had the same connection with God in the garden,
Right. That's my point too. It doesn't make any sense if you have that relationship with God to go against it. Especially if he said, "Look, you can have everything you want except for this, and this is what will happen to you." With the relationship they had, I mean, the most intimate possible relationship you could say Adam and Eve had, besides the angels, for them to, it is just, it boggles my mind to think of why they would do that.
well, and again, I 1000% agree with you. Like, if you think about that situation you just described, it's like you're in the presence of God. You know exactly who God is. You know exactly what God is capable of. Not exactly, but you have some indication. God is not a mystery to you, essentially. And yet you still choose to rebel against God. Like you said, that's incomprehensible, right?
Hmm.
Then we look at someone like Adam and Eve, and it's like, okay, you guys literally walk with God in the garden. Okay. God was speaking to you. You guys saw him. Again, God was not a mystery to you guys, but yet you freely chose to disobey him. Right. As to the motivations, as to why those beings, those individuals made those choices, I couldn't tell you. You would, and I'm not sure the Bible reveals it other than sin, right? A desire to rebel against God, right? But I mean, that seems like a question you would have to ask those individuals. Like, why did you take this step and do XYZ when you had so much? Like, an indication of this for me is do you recall what Adam was doing while Eve was partaking of the fruit?
Can't remember. No.
So one of the things that happens is that Adam is sitting there while Eve is eating. I mean, he's standing there. Where's
they
it?
don't
Where's it at?
really say it explicitly, but she turns and hands him the fruit right after she takes a bite,
One
which
second.
implies that he's right there.
Yeah, that's
Implies that
when,
women are the whole, are at fault for all of our problems.
Not where I was
Sorry.
going.
because it doesn't say it explicitly, but it does because it says he was standing there. Like, let me find it.
Then she gave
Okay.
some
The
to her
woman was
husband who was
convinced.
with her.
She saw that the tree was beautiful and the fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So right there, it's giving you her motivation. Okay. She wanted the wisdom because remember what God told her, right? She wanted the wisdom. So it's telling you she had a reason to disobey God in her own mind, right? Then it says So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. So it makes it clear that he was with her the whole time. You see what I mean? Like, and she hands it off to him. So my question in this whole scenario, Adam, who receives this direct command from God, this is the whole reason I brought it here. So he's watching Eve do this. Why didn't he slap the fruit out of her hand or be like, hey, Eve, stop what you're doing? We know what God said, right? Part of me, and this is a speculation back to what you were saying, James, is maybe the motivation was that he wanted to see if she would actually die. Maybe he has some reason, and that's a speculation, but either way, he has some reason why he didn't stop her. And then he eats
God
from himself.
God created man first, created Adam.
Yes.
And then from what we know in the Bible, he created Eve to be a helpmeet for man.
Yes.
So God created woman to be a helpmeet, knowing that she would not help man.
Just the way you phrase that.
Sorry, this is the way I think, and it's maybe my downfall. I'm just saying, like,
Can I ask a clarifying question though as well? It sounds like what you're struggling with is God's motivations.
yeah, for sure.
So it sounds like when we were talking about free will, you're understanding what we're describing with free will. Like it sounds like we're on the same page there, right? I'm just clarifying.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to think, and Ron, maybe you know, I'm not sure of any Bible passages other than what we kind of described ourselves. And I don't know the specific Bible passages of like, what were God's motivations for creating humans?
Right. Why create? Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head, like a passage that says God created because XYZ, other than what I was showing earlier, where it's like he gave the right, basically, and I'm putting an asterisk by this because I don't want to say yes or no in case somebody else out there is like, oh no, this passage here says it or implies it or something like that. But off of the top of my head, the only thing I can think of is the passages that talk about how God wants a people to himself. That seems to be the motivation that's provided by the Bible as to why God is creating. He desires to have a group of people for himself that essentially he will take into eternity. And this life, this experience that we're living through is a proving ground, essentially, to determine, does a person want to spend eternity with God or not?
Well,
You know?
hold on. Sorry. When we go to heaven, do we have free will in heaven?
Yes.
So when we're in heaven, we'll be able to turn away from God or sin or do something in heaven.
Like, I don't know. I don't believe so, to tell you the truth, only because I think those who will go into eternity, because I don't like to say heaven, I like to think more of like the kingdom of God, because it'll be here on earth and the new creation. But I get your point.
You see where
I
I'm
think
going
though
with that?
I think that those who are going into eternity will have an understanding of what happens when you turn from God. So they won't desire to turn from God. Back to
And
what
you're
we
saying
saw
Adam and Eve
here.
didn't have that understanding, or the angels or Lucifer didn't have that understanding.
I'm saying that I don't believe Adam and Eve had that understanding based on what we're seeing in Genesis, right? She thought this fruit was going to give her wisdom. She desired it. She thought it was going to give her something more than what she could get. Lucifer is a little bit different because it wasn't that he desired that, how can I put it? Lucifer desired to be worshiped as God. That's clear in Isaiah and Ezekiel when they talk about Lucifer, O son of the morning, right? How he wanted to ascend to the throne of God or the heights of God. I think those who go into eternity are going to have what Adam and Eve are missing in this piece, and knowledge of, look, this is what happens when we turn from God. It reminds me of my friend Michael, who is a former addict, right? He knows what it's like to pick up a pipe or to smoke or to pop a pill and where it leads. right? Once he got saved and once all of that got cleared from him, that desire was gone. He talks about, yeah, those things are still out there in the world, but he has no desire to go after them because he knows where it leads and he doesn't want to find himself back in that place. Does that make sense? And so I think the people who go into eternity are going to have a very good understanding of the devastation that was brought into creation once people turned from God.
I think where you're going with that is well, Ron. And something that I think of in Revelation is how he creates a new heaven and a new earth. I think with what Ron is saying about how before we go to that new heaven and that new earth, there's that decision that gets made that those going there don't want to return to sin. They don't want to return to those things. And then they are gifted with a place where it's completely gone. But they've already previously made their stance known before they get there. Does that make sense?
So it does. So what I hear you guys saying is that God desires to have people with him in eternity that freely chose that life that way. Because I mean, it's like, why didn't he just create eternity? I'm not trying to circle back. I want to stay on this direction that we're going here. I still have those questions, but I mean, I'm trying to follow you guys. So it sounds like God desires to have people around him that freely chose him.
Basically,
Yeah.
they want to be there. That's the simplest way to put it. Right.
I mean, but don't you think that if we all genuinely knew that we'd all want to be there?
No, the Bible doesn't teach you that at all.
We go
because go back to what we were talking. There's two instances I can show you. One is Satan and the fallen angels. Again, back to what you had said earlier. It's insane that they would choose to rebel against God, considering God is not a mystery to them, and yet they still turned against him. That means they're wanting something other than God. Same thing with the Israelites. That's why the Old Testament is so important, because you see when they come out of Egypt, God is not a mystery to them. They witness the plagues. God is literally walking with them. They see the column of smoke in the daytime, the column of fire in the evening. God is speaking directly to Moses. They have the angel of the Lord with his name written on him, that's following them through the desert. He's protecting them against all these tribes that are attacking them. The Red Sea, the splitting of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's army on it, feeding them with manna in the desert, on and on and on. Like God is not a mystery to them. And yet when you read the account, you see that they're constantly rebelling against God. There's even a point where they're like, we should go back to Egypt. Like, we don't trust God to get us to this destination. We should just go back. The Bible makes it clear that just because you see God does not mean you want him. Because one of the consequences of desiring God, or one of the things that comes with desiring God, is submitting to him. He's the authority. He sets the tone. He decides what goes. And a lot of the people through the biblical account that you see who do not want God, they don't want to submit to him. That's literally Satan's story.
So we have to experience sin to know that we don't want sin.
I don't think we have to, but I think that's what's happened in the story, in the account. You know, it's like a phrase. When I was young, my friend Derek used to say this because his grandfather used to say it all the time. If you can learn from your own mistakes, you're good. If you can learn from other people's mistakes, you're awesome. I think that's the story of humanity, is that, like you're saying, could we have gone through this without all the trouble? Yes, I believe so. However, we didn't. And if we want to understand that, well, sorry guys, it's like I'll stop and it's like, and then I'll keep going. So I'm just going to finish this thought.
I'm fully into
famous
it, man.
for it, so.
If we don't understand that completely, I think the reference that we have to look at is our own life. Teeples, one time, we were arguing in the parking lot. I remember this argument. This is before he got saved. And Teeples and I, when we used to argue, again, it was almost like a shouting match. We're in the parking lot going back and forth. And he was frustrated. He was asking very similar questions to what you're asking now. And he was frustrated by the fact that, I remember it clearly because at one point we were in Genesis and we were dealing with the garden situation. And at one point he had asked me the question, Why is God holding me responsible for what Adam and Eve did? I don't know if you remember that conversation, Teeples. And the response was, he's not. Because you think, and it was frustrating for Teeples because he's like, almost, and I think he actually said it, if I had been given the opportunity, right, I wasn't given the opportunity not to choose to take the fruit, right? Almost like it's unfair. Adam was given the opportunity to not choose the fruit. He messes up. And then where's my chance to not take the fruit? In the conversation, making him aware that every day you sin, you're taking of the fruit. Like God is giving you the opportunity. But every time you tell a lie, every time you steal, every time you blaspheme God, that's you taking the fruit because you're disobeying God. At the core, you're doing what Adam did. And so
Well,
God's
hold up.
holding you responsible for what you did. Sorry, go ahead.
But God only gave Adam and Eve, they only had one opportunity to disobey God. They didn't have any other stipulation. So, in my mind, at that point, there was no other possibility of disobeying God.
Well, we only record one stipulation in the scriptures. Remember, Adam lived for what I think is like 600 years. And so, the Bible doesn't give you a full account of his life. It just gives you account of the most probably important event in his life, which is the fall.
Well, I mean,
And
before the fall, like, but up until he ate of the fruit, up until that
mhm,
point, there was only one stipulation. Maybe after there was more, but I'm saying he said this is the one thing you can't do. So they could do anything else.
right, they could do anything else, but once he provides the back to why the scenario was brought, because sorry, remember it's God who's bringing the scenario or the situation to Adam and Eve by raising the concern with the fruit. Before that, they weren't aware that they could disobey God. They had no need to. They had no desire. But once he introduces the fruit and says, "Look, anything in the garden you can have except this one tree, right? This one fruit on this one tree." Now all of a sudden, they're presented with this dilemma of, do I listen to God or do I reject God? Do I accept what he said or do I reject what he said? Free will. Yeah.
Can I also add, might be an unpopular opinion, the gravity of what they chose, even though it was one thing, the weight of the one thing that they chose was huge, massive,
Right.
like generationally problematic. We kind of have a blessing in that while we sin and it's a problem, some of this, and I'm not trying to say one sin is lighter than another, but we don't have a sin that immediately causes massive detrimental, immediate negative effects to us.
You're right on the immediate part, but I would say burning in hell for all of eternity is just as detrimental. Or
Well, I think Teeples, to your point, I think they face the same problem because remember, did death come immediately to them? It's like staggered out. They died spiritually, but
Yes,
physically, the effect came way later.
I
yeah, but they
agree,
damned
but
everybody at that point.
Say that again.
we,
Sorry.
They damned everybody at that moment.
Death comes into the world, yes. And
yeah.
that's definitely an unfortunate consequence that everyone has to bear. Agreed.
Well,
Uh,
and
But
there were
everyone,
many,
everyone is not, again, everyone is not, I wouldn't, the part I would disagree with is everyone's condemned at that point because everyone is not condemned because
agreed.
we know that there are those who choose to be with God, which he then accepts. What happens is the only people who stand condemned are the ones who reject Christ. And not just Christ. I mean, there's a whole nother thing that goes into this, like what happens what do you do with people before the crucifixion and all this other stuff, which we can eventually get into. But as far as after the crucifixion, those who have heard their rejection of God and the knowledge he's made available to them to trust in him, their rejection, that's them rejecting God. That's not, they could be saved. They choose not to be.
To clarify as well, you have the thorns and thistles, you have complications of childbirth, you have having to work the land. These are all things that came right after the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's why I brought up the immediate side effects of it.
do you guys think that we have at least 2 more years on this planet. And the reason I say that is because I'm starting flight school. So after this meeting, I'm going to study for 2-3 hours to
Oh,
pass
so sorry.
no. I was saying it for a reason. I'm basically studying in all my free time, and I don't have the study, even though I right now have the desire to kind of study this more of the Bible. I don't have the time in my worldliness or whatever because I'm going to flight school, and for the next 2 years, I'm going to be literally drowned in flight school.
Hmm.
I hope we have 2 more years left on this planet for me to dive a little deeper.
What I would encourage you in, James, is to continue to do what you've been doing, which is being willing to talk with us. You know, that's it. I'm when we left the conversation yesterday. I know you had to step away to go pick up Kyler. Teeples and I were talking about Pawson, and one of the topics that came up was how Pawson talked about his father. His father had a journal where he would keep track of all the people that he brought to Christ. And one of the key things that Pawson talks about is that those people came to a knowledge of Christ and faith in Christ because of his father's friendship with the men and women that he had put in that book. And that's the key thing for, I think, Teeples and myself, is that we just a keep the friendship, but then also keep the lines of communication open. That's why when we get on these talks, we're not like, okay, we only have to talk about the Bible. No. Let's talk about whatever comes to mind.
Hmm.
Because the valuable thing in this is the friendship. And I believe that God uses that as a tool to help, you know, open up your mind. Like you were saying yesterday, there's all kinds of things people said that got you to think in ways that you hadn't been thinking before. And that was important for me in my own, not just coming to Christ, but also as I learned more about Christ, the people who I was interacting with, they were just good friends. Jordan Lysandra, I loved a lot of the time we were able to spend together. Pastor Will, I really, I often think of Pastor Will like an older brother because it's
Hmm.
so much, our personalities were so close, and culturally, there's things that we could relate to. People, the Potter twins, and on and on and on. And it's just my wife. And that's what I would say. You have two believers in your family, your daughter and your wife. And then you have all the believers around you. And so my firm belief is that God has not abandoned you because of that. And you haven't abandoned him because, again, you're on this phone call. So my encouragement would just be to continue to seek him. God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. The scriptures are clear on that. So just let him work.
Hmm. Well,
Not only
I
that,
I don't know
God
of
is,
any other religion where there's an eternal damnation. So that's why I keep the company that I keep because like I said, I don't want to be right, in what I'm thinking if the latter is hell. So yeah, I'm going to surround myself with many people that believe the only hope that we might have, if that makes sense.
well, there are a few religions outside of Christianity that preach eternal damnation, but I'll
I don't
save
want to
that for another.
know.
That if you're
And
struggling with the questions you're already struggling with, I can think of a couple where you would run circles around them because of their lack of ability to answer those questions.
but the scriptures also say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? But I don't think people fall in love, or at least maintain that love, out of fear. That's one thing to consider. I know that you have a lot of things you're wrestling with, James. And I think ultimately what drives a person to follow God is what I said earlier in terms of God's motivation, which is that the people who go into eternity want to be there with God. As one pastor I heard once say, he said, if you don't want God in this life, there's no way you're going to want him forever in eternity. So I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But I understand a lot of the things that you've raised. So we'll just continue to grapple with them.
Yeah, you got to leave the viewers wanting more, right?
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Maybe this will go viral, and we'll.
Can I also just add some words of encouragement, James? I had many points, and I still have these points where I'm just like, what am I doing? If literally everything falls apart next year or next month or in the coming months, like, what am I really doing? And there's passages that talk about God's desire for us to give our all in everything that we do in order to share his glory. And it's people seeing us doing our best, even amidst all the craziness, that we then get to give a testimony of, I do this because I love God, and that's what he asks of me. So you talked about, like, do you even have 2 more years on this planet? Still put your all in, like, and do it to the best of your ability. And like, you have a wife and kid who need you and need that support, and like, God sees that and honors that. I don't think any of that goes on deaf ears when it comes to him. So I don't know if that's encouraging at all, but I would keep doing it. If I give a joke answer, you at least have 7, but that's a joke answer.
Yeah. Okay. I get that. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Oh, so you're post trib. Got it. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation I'd love to have eventually.
True. But then, yeah, sorry. Nice Teeples.
Hey, I actually
Teeples,
got that one. Go figure.
Teeples, do you mind praying us out real quick?
I can do that. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for this evening that we were able to have James, Ron, and I, and just talking about you, learning deeper about just the truths of you and being able to dig into the word and fellowship together, Lord. I ask that this fellowship can continue in all ways, in fun conversation, in Bible conversation, just continuing to be around one another, Lord. And I know we can be far distances from one another. Sounds like James in Casa Grande. Ron, I know, is in West Phoenix, and I'm all the way out in Texas, Lord. But I know we can still come together and meet, and I ask that you can just give us those opportunities and allow to open those doors to where we can continue to meet over Zoom when we visit, just any of those moments that we can have to hang out and just continue to share in each other's lives, Lord. Please watch over us as we go through the rest of our evenings. Please watch over James's studies. And like what we said, just open up the door so that he can continue to work his hardest to show the glory that you've provided through him, Lord. Same with all of us with our jobs, and just what we're doing, Father. For we love you, and we say all these things in your holy and wonderful name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. All right, gentlemen. Thank you again for participating. This was really a treat. And like I said, I hope in the future we'll be able to cover other more expansive kind of topics, whether it's manga, anime, comics, politics even, and seeing where that leads us. So,
Oh, politics is an interesting one.
yeah.
Bye, guys. Have a good night.
Yeah. Have a good
Have a
night.
good one, man.
Bye.